What would you regard as essential skills required from translators for efficiency to work in an office?
Within the framework of the e-transfer project, we identified a large number of competencies, and we believe that all of these competencies are absolutely necessary to work as a specialized translator. There are some skills and competencies that we take for granted. For example, translation competence, language competence, inter and transcultural competence, but there are some specific ones that we decided to highlight, such as review and revision competence, domain-specific competence, which is an absolute must for specialized translators, technological competence, information mining and terminology, and professional competencies, which is an overall cover term for all the skills that one needs to have to be able to work on the market. If we start with the first one, linguistic competence, there are a couple of things that we need to highlight. Well, most universities and training institutions don't offer language courses because they believe that it's something that the trainees already should have, a very sound knowledge of the language. Both the A and the B or C languages obviously must be very good. Now, we believe at our university that it might be a good idea to offer some language courses, some language development courses, which go hand in hand with the translation classes. So for instance, if you work on a text that the translators will be working on, that it will offer some plus for the students. We also know that learning languages or maintaining languages is like swimming against a strong current. You need to do something every single day in order to sustain that particular level. So my advice to students is that if they don't have a language development course at the university, they should do their utmost to develop their languages. And they may sound commonplaces, but they should be reading books in the mother tongue and in the foreign language. They should watch films, go to movies, and do everything in their capacity to improve their languages. Read online papers, magazines. This is something that they need to always bear in mind, that keeping and sustaining the right linguistic level is absolutely essential. Besides linguistic competence, translation competence is also a very strong point. Here at training institutions, we teach our trainees how to acquire some techniques and strategies, such as transfer operations, lexical and grammatical operations, cohesive devices, how to play around with clauses, how to reorganize chunks, segments. And I think these will allow them to make conscious decisions, and that's the most important thing. You don't just start translating something, you know exactly what you're doing and you make conscious decisions. What we also teach our trainees, and it's something that they will have to remember when they work on the market, is looking at the text. Who was it written by? Who is the target audience? What is the function or the scopus of the text? And sadly, when they go to the market and start working for translation offices, they sometimes have no time to do that, and sometimes translation offices prevent them from, delve into the text very deeply, because it's a question of time. They don't have to read it through, they don't have time to elaborate on the issue, which is a problem. I think my advice to trainees when they start working on the market is that they really should think about the function, the writer, the reader of the text, and they should really keep this in mind when they are working. Also, sometimes training institutions are criticized for spending too much time with one particular text. Time is a crucial factor for offices, and they want students to translate 2,000, 3,000 words while we only give them half a page. Well, we think that at training institutions, this is the time when you can actually work with the text, you elaborate on it, you spend time, you chisel this part and that part. It's something that you will not have time to do at the office, we understand that. But at the training institution, we do. And we hope that the trainees will have the opportunity to accelerate the process, but keep the same quality. Third item on the e-transfer competence card is intercultural and transcultural competences. I think it goes without saying that being familiar with the target culture is absolutely essential. also with your own culture. So we always need to emphasize the importance of the A language and the knowledge about the A language culture. But knowing and learning about the target culture is a lifelong process, a life learning process. If you work with English, you must be familiar with the culture of the UK, the US, Australia, and we didn't even talk about post-colonial countries. Also with Spanish, there are 20 countries alone that speak Spanish, and also with German, you need to be familiar with the culture of Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and some other places. So if you work as a translator, you must make sure that you are familiar with the principles, the practices, the institutions, institutional frameworks, and many other things. You must keep abreast with all the changes that happen in your society and in the target society. In one word, you need to have a very sound general knowledge. You will not have time to look up everything. It's much better for you to keep track of what's happening and to be aware of the major items of news. What is my advice? I think you should obviously read papers, quality papers, broadsheet dailies. I know the number is, there are maybe online contents are more typical. It doesn't matter where you read them. Read them. Magazines, such as The Economist in the English culture, for instance, or Profil for Austria, but you know your own examples. Just on a regular basis, listen to podcasts, for instance. That's a very good way when you're doing the washing up at home, you prepare for the classes or something. You can just listen to these items of news in an audio version as well. You can also visit events organized by cultural institutions in your country, such as the British Council or the Goethe Institute or the Cervantes Institute, because they will invite guests that will give you an added value in terms of culture, and you will be able to meet people who attend the same event. So I suggest this is something that you consciously pay attention to. Another important sphere of competence is review and revision competence. I think this is a competence that goes hand in hand with translation. When we learn translation at a training institution, we develop a kind of conditional reflex, because we tend to revise everything. We revise ourselves when we do a translation, and we, before handing it, we go through again and keep stock of the mistakes. We also look at our mates and peers' work in the classroom and everywhere else. If you go to a restaurant, you look at the menu instinctively and look for mistakes, what sort of realia translation mistakes there are, for instance. And also if you go to a movie and you look at the subtitles, you have this conditioned reflex that you immediately start criticizing it. And it's something a translator and also an interpreter does all the time. So what we really need to teach our trainees is, just how critical can you be? What are the things that you really need to correct, and what are improvements? And this is something that also happens the same way at translation offices, because you want to economize with time. You only want to correct what is really necessary to correct. And also translators will need to understand and learn how not to enforce their own style on that particular text. So these are long processes, and they can be very difficult to acquire. What we can advise our translators when focusing on revision is, when they get their feedback, they should make an inventory of the errors and the mistakes. They should be very conscious of the errors they made and try to eliminate them. Very often happens that you get a feedback and you don't look at it. You just know, yes, these were my mistakes, but you don't start pondering about the possible background reasons, why you have made such a mistake, why you do it again, for instance. It's something that you should really, as a translator, in the long run and for your own professional development, should learn to do, is to keep an inventory of these problems, be systematic with the feedback you receive, and also try to weigh what is a serious problem, what is a small problem. This is something that you, as a reviser, will also need to do in the office. In the translation office, you start working as a linguist, they call it, as a translator, and later on, if you're good enough, you can start revising. So revision is something which is not systematically taught at training institutions, so it needs to be embedded in the translation course, and it's something that we trainers really need to teach our trainees, because apparently at the end of the day they will end up as revisers and they will need to work as revisers. Another reason why we included revision and review in the competence card, the etransfer competence card, was that with the advance of machine translation, translators more often than not will have to revise already translated texts, not translate from scratch. So what they have to do is post-edit. So what they need is a competence to revise, to review, and to proofread. So these are skills that are absolutely necessary, and again, trainers and trainees both consciously will have to work on this competence. Competence, domain-specific competence, and this is an absolute must for a specialized translator. While interpreters may be able to afford to get away with less specific knowledge, or they may be superficial when they do their job, translators cannot afford to make such mistakes, because words fly but texts remain on paper. And therefore, in the majority of the cases, I would say translators should really work in a field that they are familiar with. You must have a field of expertise, and it's something that trainers can already emphasize at the beginning of a trainee's studies, that there should be a little market niche, something at least that you specialize in. It's perhaps worth taking a look at the current market statistics. What are the most often translated fields? For instance, IT, law, finance. It depends. Each and every country might have its own market niches, or most frequently translated areas or fields, but there is also an international trend that is worth keeping track of. So I suggest that you should pick a topic, a field, maybe one that you know the nuts and bolts of, in and out, but you may want to have 3 or 4 fields that you very well know and be able to translate, but make sure you don't translate in a domain that you're not familiar with. If you have to do so, make sure there is somebody who will revise your work, somebody who has the domain-specific knowledge, who knows the terminology, and who knows the principles and the concepts behind, because that seems to be the biggest problem. Sometimes you don't even realize what the problem might be, and even if you are a translator and you have learned that you have to be suspicious with every item, you might just overlook something in a domain-specific text because you don't just realize what the term is in that specific context. So be very careful and be conscious in your work to work on both terminology-wise and also domain-specific knowledge-wise what you want to work with, and make sure that you are committed to 1 or 2 specific fields. There is also a separate competence on our card, on the eTransfer card, and it's a competence that no translator in the 21st century can get by without. And we are not just talking about CAT tools. There is a broader spectrum of tools that translators need to be familiar with. What we can offer in training institutions, and actually here at the University of Technology and Economics, we try to pay huge attention to this, and we managed to introduce a skills lab, which offers not only the basic tools and technologies, but also different software facilities like Adobe or Abby or some other software devices that students can learn how to use. And this is a setting which imitates real-life translation office environment, and students can learn how to model at least the work which is being done in translation offices. And my advice is, if you really want to have a competitive edge as a translator, you're not only familiar with basic CAT devices like MemoQ or Trados and maybe the software, but you try to add some other knowledge. For instance, desktop publishing, DTP, is one of the upcoming areas, or technical writing is something that you should also learn how to do. Or maybe you want to learn how to involve machine translation in your work. If you are a freelancer, you can do it yourself, and if you work for a company, you may want to be an expert on it and how to do post-editing. So this is a very rapidly changing industry. There are new skills all the time, and if you really want to make sure that you are among the best ones, you try to add these skills, and technology is at the crux of all these things. Information mining and terminological competence. These are again extremely important for specialized translators. Info mining is something we tend not to speak too much about, but it is a very important competence, because info mining starts with the ability to identifying the problem. You know what to look up in a dictionary or anywhere on the internet, for instance. And if you know what to look up, then you will have to decide where you will find that piece of information and whether that piece of information you have found is reliable or not. Now, this is a process that trainees need to acquire, and sometimes they do not even get as far as identifying the problem. So what I usually tell them is that just be suspicious. Make sure, and in the classroom we have time for that, make sure that you ponder over every single item on the piece of paper in front of you, because you might miss a problem, you might miss a term, you might miss a translation issue that you should have tracked. At the end of the day, they will have to come up with an acceptable solution, and they may be able to defend it, because sometimes if there is a claim at the translation office, the translator will have to defend his or her choice, and unless you do so and you know where that piece of information came from, you will not be able to do that. So as you know, it's not, if we talk about competencies, we have knowledge, we have skill, we have the attitude, and the right attitude here is absolutely important, that you have to be suspicious and you have to double check your work all the time. And I think info mining is especially important. So terminology is another issue. Terminology comes into the picture when you have identified the problem, you have come up with the right term, you also should know what the concept behind is, what conceptual system it belongs to, and how to build your terminology later. And building your terminology system and do terminology management goes hand in hand with the technological competence, but that's another matter. Since we have a fit-for-market scheme, we put a large emphasis on professional aspects, and professional competence constitutes a very detailed section in our competence card, which has several elements, including project management, entrepreneurship, marketing and customer care, and quality management, quality assurance issues. Well, professional competence is a mixed bag, I should say, and translation or translator training institutions tend to pay minimum attention to these aspects, hoping that the lion's share of the work will be done by translation offices anyway. So there are some competencies or skills here, like being able to work with project management software, for instance, or liaising with the clients, helping our translators keep the deadline, and all kinds of things which you cannot really do at the translator training institution. So I would just like to offer some advice how trainees can bridge these gaps, because there might be some curricula where market subjects are not introduced or not part of the system. They may be embedded in certain other subjects, but they are not specifically offered for trainees as such. So what can trainees do when they don't have these opportunities where they can learn specific things? Well, I think they can do some voluntary work. They can decide to go and work for a translation office, translation bureau, for even a short period of time, just to have an insight into the working process and what requirements he or she will have to comply with once he or she starts working there. It might also be a good idea to join associations like freelance associations at the national level, or visit conferences organized by international associations such as the EUATC or GALA or some other associations, and visit their websites on a regular basis. Because you can get a lot of important pieces of information just by reading about the events and reading about the issues that they discuss there. You can also watch lots of events online. For instance, in Brussels, every year there is a huge conference entitled Translating Europe Forum, which is available for any viewers in a streamlined format. So you can get first-hand information on the latest trends, the latest issues. It's a 2-day event, and it's very, very interesting for trainees, market representatives, and teachers alike. You may also want to attend conferences, and not only conferences on translation, but also any domain-specific conferences that, for instance, are organized in the topic that you work with. For instance, history, finance, law. You may just want to look out for these conferences on the internet and decide to visit. The website as well, the materials that they publish, the studies that eventually are the results of these conferences, they might come very handy as well. Also, you can attend events that universities organize. And again, let me just say what we here at BME organize, what kind of events where market experts can also attend and are regularly invited. We have the Trainees Meet Professional events, the poster of which is just right behind me. We invite graduates, market experts, and translators, interpreters, diplomats, all kinds of people who work in this sector, so that we can have an idea of their work, about their work. And sometimes we organize forums or dialogues, discussion events, where we pick a certain topic and then we invite lots of representatives from different sectors. And obviously these are for trainees who can attend, but also any outsiders, any former graduates or anybody interested can come and watch these events. We also have a mentoring scheme where we try to invite professionals, experts working on the market, both interpreters and translators, to pair up with a trainee of ours, and they can, for a few weeks, few months, work together. If it's translation, the trainee can have a glimpse, have an insight into translator's work, not only in terms of the professional issues like how to revise something, how to change words, but also how to comply with market requirements. What is the deadline? What fee will I charge, for instance? How do I work with other translators in a team, for instance? So there can be several aspects that this mentoring scheme can offer for our trainees and extra. And also we organize group mentoring opportunities. We visit offices, translation offices, where students can ask their questions. We also visit courts to watch court interpreting sessions, and I strongly advise to training institutions to start a mentoring scheme, because it pays off the lot of work that is behind it. So these are the things that trainees can do to become more familiar with market aspects if they are not offered these in the framework.